A house that traps you, a never-ending darkness, and whispers that won't stop. What happens when the very place you fear becomes your prison, and escape is no longer an option? Join me as we uncover a true crime story that blurs the line between horror and reality. Can one woman fight the pull of this terrifying house, or will she become one of its lost souls forever? Watch until the end to discover the shocking truth, because the house always wins. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. The air felt thick, oppressive, cold, as if something was waiting to jump out from the shadows. Alone in the dark, Sarah glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The house had always felt empty. But tonight? It felt different. A heavy weight on her chest. She could hear the faintest sound, like a creak from the floorboards above. Her heart raced. Her eyes darted toward the staircase. But nothing. Just silence. Then there it was again. A low whisper. Her breath hitched in her throat. The whisper came from the hallway, just beyond the kitchen. Sarah stepped back, feeling the cold floor beneath her bare feet. Her fingers brushed the knife resting on the counter, but she didn't grab it. Something inside told her not to. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. Instinct. Her body froze. And then, a shadow. It moved. Quickly. Suddenly, the kitchen light flickered. For a brief moment, she saw the shape. A figure. Tall. Gaunt. Its eyes, wide, hollow, empty. Her breath caught. She couldn't move. Couldn't scream. It was like the air itself had thickened around her, making it impossible to do anything. The figure stepped forward. Closer. Closer. Until it was right in front of her. Then it reached out. A hand. Cold as ice. Sarah stumbled back, her back hitting the wall. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough. Suddenly, the front door slammed open. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Someone was coming. The figure vanished. Just like that. And Sarah was left standing in the dark, shaking, in disbelief. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder. Her heartbeat rang in her ears. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. It was real, and it was coming for her. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Her eyes flicked around the room. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. The air felt colder still. A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to move, but her feet were glued to the floor. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer. Each step felt like it was echoing inside her chest. Then, another whisper. This one was closer, almost as if it was right behind her. Sarah whipped around. Nothing. Her breath quickened. The house seemed to close in on her. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to leave before it came back. But the front door, was wide open. It wasn't supposed to be. She hadn't opened it. The sound of the wind outside seemed unnatural, almost too harsh, like it was mocking her. A low, deep groan reverberated through the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. Sarah took a shaky step toward the door. She couldn't see anything outside, just darkness. But she could feel it. Something was out there. Something was waiting. A sudden movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze. A figure. Not the same one. Smaller. Less distinct. But it was there. Her heart stopped. The figure lingered just beyond her sight, flickering like a shadow in the corner of her mind. Then, without warning, it lunged. A sound of ragged breathing filled the room. Hot breath on her neck. She spun around to face it. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence again. It was worse. Because now she wasn't sure what was real. The walls closed in. The ceiling felt lower. A shiver ran through her entire body. She couldn't stay here anymore. Her only thought now was to escape. The door. It was her only chance. But as she stepped toward it, the floor beneath her seemed to groan with every step. The door slammed shut. Behind her, she couldn't escape, and she was not alone.
The door.
It was locked. She hadn't touched it, but now it was sealed tight, as though it had never been open at all. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Something was wrong. Something she couldn't explain. A shadow flickered again, but this time, closer. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could feel it. A presence. Cold and heavy. It moved across the room in an unnatural way. Not walking. Floating. Her breath caught as she turned slowly, her mind screaming for her to run. But her feet wouldn't obey. A sudden crash echoed from above. Something heavy hit the floor. Sarah's head jerked up toward the ceiling. Her mind raced. The footsteps. The whispers. They were all coming from upstairs. Her gaze shot toward the staircase, still in the same place as before. But it didn't matter now. Her instinct, her survival, told her to stay away. She wanted to scream, to call out, but no sound left her throat. A low growl resonated from the hallway, growing louder, closer. Her heart pounded. Each beat felt like it might tear through her chest. Then the temperature dropped sharply. Sarah shivered. A figure stood in the doorway. Not the same figure as before. This one was smaller, hunched over. The features distorted. Eyes too large, mouth too wide. It moved toward her slowly, almost deliberately. Her mind screamed. Her body refused to obey. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the counter again. There was nothing left to do. No escape. The figure stepped closer. It whispered her name. Soft, like a breath on the wind. Sarah's stomach turned. But the words, they were familiar. She had heard them before. Her own name. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. And then, it reached out. Its hand, skeletal and cold, grabbed her arm. Her entire body went stiff. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The shadowy figure leaned in. And for a brief moment, she saw its face. It wasn't just a stranger. It was her, or something that looked like her. The same eyes. But it grew louder, closer. The hum wasn't just sound. It was vibration. It shook the ground beneath her feet. It echoed through her very bones. And then she saw it. A light. Not bright, but dim. It flickered weakly, like a candle struggling to stay alight in a storm. It was in the distance, but it grew, expanding. She moved toward it, instinctively, her legs moving as if they had a mind of their own. The light grew larger, more defined. The room around her began to take shape again. But it wasn't the house she knew. It was a cold, decaying place, filled with shadows that danced along the walls. The floor beneath her feet was cracked and broken, like an abandoned ruin. She felt the air shift again. This time, she didn't turn around. She couldn't. Something was there. Something that made her spine stiffen, her breath catch in her throat. It was too close. A figure stepped from the darkness, its form almost blending into the shadows. It moved silently, just like the others, but there was something different about this one. It was taller. Its features were sharper. Its eyes, empty, void of any life. It stepped closer, until it stood just behind her. Sarah's heart pounded harder. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The same twisted grin stretched across its face. And then it spoke. "You didn't listen," it said. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was a voice from her past, one she had tried to forget. A voice she never thought she'd hear again. Her breath caught in her throat. "Why didn't you listen?" it repeated, its tone icy and unforgiving. The world around her started to fade once more. The light dimmed. Her limbs grew heavier. And then, just like that, she was no longer standing in that ruined place. She was back in the house. But it wasn't the same house. It was darker, the air thicker, and the whispers were louder than ever. And Sarah knew, deep in her bones, that she had never truly left. She had only just begun to understand the true horror that awaited her. The walls around her seemed to pulse, alive with a dark energy. The house groaned, like it was waking up, stretching its long, twisted limbs. The shadows in the corner shifted, moving as though they had a life of their own. Sarah could feel the eyes of the house on her, watching, waiting. Her heart raced, thumping loudly in her chest, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers. They were everywhere now, not just in her ears, but inside her head. A constant, suffocating presence. "Join us," they whispered. "Stay with us forever." Her fingers twitched, desperately searching for something, anything to hold on to. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. But every door, every window, was locked. As if the house had claimed her. Her feet felt like lead, each step harder than the last. She moved through the darkened halls, the air colder with each passing second. Every room felt the same, silent, oppressive, like a tomb. But then, through the darkness, a figure appeared. It was her reflection, or something that looked like her. She froze. The figure didn't move. It stood in the hallway, staring, its face twisted into that same mocking grin. A low chuckle rumbled from its throat. "Did you think you could escape?" it sneered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands shook as she reached out, but the figure didn't step back. It didn't have to. It was part of the house, part of the darkness that had consumed her. Her reflections stepped closer. The walls around her closed in, narrowing, the house shrinking like it was going to swallow her whole. But the figure wasn't finished. It reached out with a cold hand, just like before, and touched her cheek. The touch burned, colder than anything she had ever felt. "You never left," it whispered. And that's when Sarah understood. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a place where the lost were kept, where those who couldn't escape were kept forever. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crack. Her body trembled, but there was nowhere to run. The whispers became louder, all around her, filling the room until it was unbearable. The figure smiled. "You belong to us now," it said. And as the house began to close in, piece by piece, Sarah's world grew darker still. And then it was quiet. But Sarah was no longer alone. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Sarah stood frozen, her body trembling, but her mind racing. The figure, her twisted reflection, was gone, yet its presence lingered. The air around her seemed thick with something dark, something ancient. It was as if the very walls of the house were breathing, pulsing with a malevolent life force. The whispers still echoed, faint but persistent, crawling under her skin. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts. Her thoughts. Her body moved on its own, her legs carrying her down the narrow hallway. There was no choice. She had to keep moving. But the house was closing in on her. The walls seemed to shrink, the ceilings lower, the floors more unstable. With every step, it felt like the house itself was trying to trap her, to squeeze the life out of her. Suddenly, a door appeared at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was the only way out. She had to reach it. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the house itself was warning her. "Don't open the door," they hissed. "You'll never leave." Her hand reached for the doorknob, her fingers cold and shaking. The door creaked as it slowly opened, revealing a room bathed in a strange, pale light. It was a room she had never seen before. It was both familiar and unfamiliar, like a place from a distant dream. But it was wrong. Everything in the room was wrong. The walls were covered in old, tattered photographs, faces she didn't recognize, staring at her with hollow eyes. A chair sat in the center of the room, facing the door. A cold chill ran down her spine as she stepped inside. And then, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room. She spun around, heart racing, but there was no way out. The room was small, the air thick with the smell of decay. The photographs on the walls seemed to come alive, their eyes following her every move. She felt the weight of their gaze, each one burning into her soul. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It wasn't a person. It was an image, a distorted, ghostly form. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting and changing, as though it was a reflection of her own fears. The figure spoke in a voice that chilled her to the core. "You never truly left," it whispered. "You're part of us now." The room began to warp, the walls twisting and bending like they were alive. Her vision blurred, her mind spinning. The figure moved toward her, its form flickering in and out of existence, its eyes the only constant. And then it was right in front of her. Its hand reached out, cold as ice, and touched her cheek. Her body froze. The house had won. Her body froze at the touch. It felt as though her very soul was being drained, the coldness sinking deeper with each passing second. The figure didn't speak, but Sarah could hear its thoughts echoing in her mind. "You belong to us now. There's no escape." Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Her breath was shallow, ragged. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. The house had a grip on her. It was too strong. The walls continued to shift and bend, as if they were alive. The photographs on the walls seemed to ripple, their eyes following her, growing darker with each passing second. She felt the air grow even colder. Her teeth chattered as she stood frozen, the figure's presence overwhelming, suffocating. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. The pale glow in the room turned dark. The shadows stretched longer, twisting, crawling across the walls. The floor beneath her began to crack, splitting open with a low, ominous groan. Suddenly, the room began to shake. The very foundation of the house seemed to tremble. "It's time," the figure whispered, its voice cutting through her mind like a blade. The floor beneath her feet buckled, dropping her to her knees. The whispers were deafening now. They weren't just words, they were screams, wailing voices, tortured souls crying out from every corner of the room. The darkness around her seemed to swallow the light completely. And then, the room began to fall apart. The walls cracked and crumbled, revealing endless, deep blackness beyond. The floor splintered beneath her, splintering with sharp, painful cracks, like the house itself was coming undone. The figure remained in front of her, its face still shifting, still twisting. It was all around her now. "You can't fight it," it whispered. "You can't escape." And then the house collapsed. Everything was darkness. But this time, Sarah didn't feel fear. The presence of the house, the whispers, the figure, it all faded away. And in the silence, she realized there was no more running. There was no escape. And she was finally a part of the house. The darkness stretched on, endless and suffocating. Sarah could no longer feel her body. She wasn't sure if she was still alive, if time still existed. All that remained was the oppressive weight of the silence around her, wrapping around her like a shroud. Then, a flicker of light broke through the blackness. A single beam, weak and fragile, cutting through the void. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle, like a lullaby. "Welcome home, Sarah." Her eyes strained to focus on the light, and she found herself moving toward it. Her limbs, though heavy, obeyed, like an instinct she could no longer control. The beam of light grew stronger as she got closer, revealing something that looked like a doorway. But it wasn't a door. It was an opening, a tear in the fabric of the endless blackness. A passage. Something beckoned her from beyond it. She reached out. Her hand, pale and trembling, grasped the edge of the opening. Her fingers sunk into it, the sensation sending chills through her as if she were touching the very fabric of reality itself. A pull, a force, dragged her forward. She didn't have a choice. There was no turning back. The light around her swelled and expanded, and she felt herself being pulled through the doorway. But as she crossed the threshold, her surroundings didn't change. It wasn't a new place. It was still the house. But something was different. The walls stood still, unmoving, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. And there, in the center of the room, was the figure. It was waiting for her. Its twisted smile stretched impossibly wide, but its eyes were different now. They were vacant, hollow, not mocking, just empty. The figure raised its hand toward her, a motion she could feel in her bones. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Join us. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. The house had never been a trap. It had never been a prison. It was a place where lost souls gathered, where the forgotten waited. It was a place of belonging. And she was finally home. The stillness in the room grew even more suffocating. Sarah stood motionless, her body no longer her own, her mind lost in the growing fog of the house's presence. The figure's eyes, those hollow, endless voids, locked onto her once more, unblinking. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't hostile. It simply waited. She felt a pull, deeper than before, something she couldn't resist. Her fingers twitched, as if answering the unspoken call, and she stepped closer. Her feet barely touched the ground, as though the house itself was holding her up, guiding her. As she moved forward, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to melt, revealing an endless sea of faces. They were everywhere. Thousands of them, staring back at her. Some of the faces were familiar. Memories she couldn't place, echoes from her past, faces she had long forgotten. Others were strangers, their eyes full of silent sorrow, a silent plea. She could hear them now. Their voices whispered to her, their voices mingling with the ever-present whispers of the house. Welcome. Join us. Stay with us forever. Her chest tightened. Her mind screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure stepped forward, its presence looming over her like a shadow. Its grin faded, and its face softened. You are one of us now. The air around her shifted, and Sarah could feel something different in the air. A change. Something primal, something old. She could feel the energy of the house pulse through her veins. It was inescapable. She was no longer fighting. She wasn't even afraid. She understood now. This was her purpose. This was her place. And she could feel the weight of all those who had come before her. The lost, the broken, the forgotten, gathering around her. Their presence was not terrifying. It was comforting. The loneliness that had gnawed at her heart for so long finally disappeared. She felt whole. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to belong. Her reflection, the figure, and all those faces, they weren't the enemy. They were her family. And as the house settled into its quiet, eternal rhythm, Sarah closed her eyes. The whispers wrapped around her, and she smiled. Because she was home, and she would never leave. The air grew still once more, but it was no longer oppressive. It was soothing, calming. The house, with its broken walls and endless corridors, had become something different. A sanctuary. The faces, once hollow and desperate, now appeared serene, peaceful in their eternal rest. Sarah no longer felt the ache of loss, the emptiness that had plagued her for so long. She was no longer alone. Her heartbeat slowed to a steady rhythm, matching the pulse of the house. Her body, once tense and filled with fear, was now at ease. She felt the presence of the house all around her, its energy flowing through her like a part of herself. The house had accepted her. It had claimed her. And she, in return, had claimed it. The whispers were no longer urgent or frantic. They were soft, comforting, like a lullaby. She could hear them clearly now, each voice a memory, each voice a soul. You are one of us. We are all together. We are home. And as Sarah stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the quiet, eternal presence of the house, she realized that she was not trapped. She was free. The fear, the confusion, it had all been swept away, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. The house was her home now, just as it had always been for those who had come before her. Her place in the eternal cycle of souls, forever entwined with the house's dark embrace. She could feel the pull of the shadows, the soft touch of the house's presence, guiding her deeper. And for the first time, she didn't resist. She followed. Because Sarah knew now that there was no escape. There never had been. And in the end, that was what made it so perfect. The house had never been a prison. It had always been a sanctuary. And now, she was its keeper. The house stood still, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for Sarah. She had accepted it, embraced its darkness, its power. She had finally come to understand that there was no escaping its pull, no running from its grip. And yet, as the weight of her new reality settled in, she felt an overwhelming calm, a strange peace that washed over her. The house had been a place of torment at first, a labyrinth of fear, confusion, and death. But now it was home, her home. The walls no longer groaned with the ache of an endless struggle. Instead, they hummed with a quiet satisfaction, a contentment that permeated the air. She moved through the hallways, not as a lost soul, but as one who belonged. The shadows followed her, stretching and bending as she passed. But they no longer threatened her. They had become companions, guiding her steps, their cool embrace a reminder that she was no longer alone. The whispers had quieted, no longer frantic, no longer desperate. They were soft, like a gentle breeze, brushing past her ear with each step. She could hear the voices now, each one familiar, each one a part of her. Welcome home. Stay with us forever. You are never alone. She walked deeper into the house, through rooms she had once feared, but now saw with a sense of wonder. The photographs on the walls no longer seemed distorted. The faces that once stared at her with hollow eyes now smiled, their expressions filled with understanding. The house was a place of forgotten souls, but it was also a place of redemption. A place where all those who had once been lost now found peace. And Sarah, the final soul to enter, had found her place among them. The door to the outside world had long since closed. The world beyond the house, the one she had once known, was nothing but a distant memory now. But Sarah didn't care. She had found her place, her purpose. And in the endless darkness of the house, she was finally home. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and calm. Because she knew now that there was no escape. There was only peace. The house was quiet now. The once eerie hum of the walls had faded into a soft, gentle murmur, like the sigh of an old friend settling into peaceful slumber. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her eyes closed, her body still. Everything felt right, as if she had been here all along, even before she had realized it. The shadows no longer felt like threats. They were now comforting, familiar, wrapping around her like an old, well-worn cloak. She could feel the presence of those who had come before her, their silent voices echoing in the corners of the house, like a chorus of those who had found their place within its dark walls. And for the first time since she had entered, Sarah smiled. The fear, the confusion, the need to run, all of it had evaporated. There was no longer a need to fight, no need to escape, because the house had shown her something profound. The house was not evil. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary for the lost, a resting place for those who had wandered too far, those who had nowhere else to go. And now, Sarah was no longer lost. She was part of the house. The walls that once felt cold and unyielding were now alive with warmth, as if the house itself was breathing a sigh of contentment, accepting her as one of its own. The doors that once barred her path were now open, not to escape, but to show her the endless paths within the house, paths she had never noticed before. She stepped forward, no longer hesitant. She walked deeper into the house, each room a new discovery, each hallway a promise of something to be found. The house was alive, and she, too, was alive within it. There would be no more fear, no more confusion. The cycle had ended. And as Sarah wandered the familiar halls, she knew that in the vast, dark expanse of the house, she was exactly where she was meant to be. At peace. Home.